We are honoured tonight to have Professor Gary Sheffield. He needs no real introduction from me. He's currently Professor of War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton, amongst many other things. We often allow speakers to give plugs to their books. If we were to ask Gary to do that, we'd be here listening to the long list of superb books he's written for the rest of the evening. He's given us his time and energy free of charge, which shows his support for organisations like this. And I must say he's been very supportive of myself, including having the best record for answering emails quickly, which is amazing given these huge commitments in this country and abroad. But I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Gary Sheffield for this evening's talk. Gary.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good. Right, well, wearing one of my many hats as president of the WFA, Western Front Association, it's a delight to give a talk to a sister organisation. And I've been a great fan of the Gallipoli Association. And I've been looking at Gallipoli, as I was saying before we kicked off, in some detail over the last 2 or 3 years. And I've been very impressed by what you've been doing and your website and the things that you've all been producing. Well, I'm going to start with slightly cheating picture because I'm going to give a quote from someone in the 7th Manchester. That's actually the 8th Manchester Gallipoli. It was the nearest I could get. The boys in our lot who were in Egypt and have been here in Gallipoli since May are all pretty well fed up and worn out. It is only natural as they have been through it and do need a long rest. Well, this was written in beginning of September 1915 by Private Bert Lee, who had arrived on Gallipoli as a reinforcement for the 1st 7th Manchesters, a territorial battalion of the 42nd East Lancs Division. And of course, the 42nd Division had landed at Cape Helles in May after training in Egypt. And since then, they've been involved in trench warfare, whether it was holding the line or attacking, pretty well without a break since then. This plus monotonous diet and endemic sickness had reduced the Manchesters, indeed the 42nd Division, indeed pretty well everybody at Cape Helles, to the sort of plight that Private Lee mentioned in his letter. Now, what I've tried to do in this talk, which is based on an article which is actually free to access from the British Journal of Military History. Just Google Gary Sheffield Gallipoli Helles and you'll get it. Is to examine the state of morale and combat motivation among the troops of British VIII Corps at Gallipoli. And this, I think, is a very useful self-contained case study, because of course we could sort of spread it out elsewhere and look at Anzac, which I've actually done as well. But I think this is quite a nice small sample, if you like, to look at. And in particular, I'm building on the work of Professor Anthony King, Tony King, who's a professor of sociology rather than history at the University of Exeter. And in his book, The Combat Soldier, which came out in 2013, he examined really combat motivation in the 2 world wars and in modern armies. What he did was build on earlier attempts to explain combat motivation and to bring it up to date. And historically, certainly from the aftermath of the Second World War, what people have tended to see as being absolutely key to keeping men in the field and actually getting them to fight is the small group. The idea that you would always fight for your friends and that basically not wanting to let your mates down or look cowardly in the eyes of your mates is key to combat motivation. Well, what he has done, what Tony King has done, actually is build on this and somewhat move away from it. So, for example, one of the most important articles, I think, on this whole morale, combat motivation stuff that's come out in recent years was written by Professor Hugh Strawn, now of St Andrews. He was at Oxford for many years. And he basically moved away from what soldiers thought to what they actually did. And Hugh Strawn's argument is that it's really training that makes a difference. If you've got men who are well trained, they can slot into their allocated roles under combat conditions. It doesn't really matter whether they know they're the guy in the next trench or not. Are they actually behaving as they have been trained? That is the key. And what critically, what I think that Tony King has done is to some extent rehabilitate this individual, Brigadier General SLA Marshall, Slam Marshall, an American combat historian who came up with a seminal study in the 1950s and early 60s, who basically argued that on the so-called empty battlefield of the 20th century, only about 1 in 4 infantrymen actually fired their weapons in anger on the battlefield. Now, this has been, his basic idea has been very heavily attacked, not least because it came out he rather cooked the books. And he simply did not have the evidence to sustain his argument. But what Tony King has done is basically say that, okay, well, let's go away from whether Marshall was precisely accurate in his views, and take his general point, which is that left to themselves, soldiers, particularly products of citizen armies such as the British Army in the first aftermath of the Second World War, its American counterparts, left themselves, they're basically passive. They will not take aggressive action unless they are brought to do so. And what King describes as the Marshall effect is overcome, he argues, by leaders, principally officers, but also NCOs, using a variety of strategies to overcome this problem. Appeals to masculinity and to patriotism, you know, be a man, fight for your country. Ideological indoctrination, you know, the British way is better than anybody else's. Mass tactics, particularly the bayonet charge. Once you wind people up and get them advancing in large numbers, it's relatively easy to get them to carry out aggressive activity. Training soldiers for extreme aggression, which, as he points out, is the opposite of what happens today, when soldiers are trained to be extremely self-controlled under combat conditions. Very different in the 2 world wars. And relying on heroic and often self-sacrificing individual leaders to motivate everybody else. Well, as I've already mentioned, I think that 8th Corps at Gallipoli, Helles, the southern bit, of course, as you know all too well, does represent a really good laboratory in which to test King's ideas. Because after all, thanks, of course, originally to Winston Churchill, and one piece of evidence I came across in my research on Gallipoli was that when an officer arrived at Gallipoli as a reinforcement in July 1915, and he happened to mention Winston Churchill's name, the reply came to the effect that if Churchill steps foot on Gallipoli, we'll basically scrag him, which is an interesting bit of information. Helles is quite self-contained, and with the exception of 29th Division, we're really talking about not terribly well-trained citizen soldiers with largely inexperienced officers. Even the 29th Division, which of course is an assemblage of regular units from all over the empire, the long service professional soldiers, the attrition rate at Gallipoli was absolutely savage, and so many of those succumbed to being killed or being wounded or falling sick, and were replaced when reinforcements came through, and they always were quite tardy. They were replaced fairly early on. let me just, before I launch into the main body of it, just get a couple of bits of definitions out of the way. The first one to say is, what is morale? It's a term that's bandied about quite a lot, but my definition is it's a state of mind that determines the attitudes of soldiers individually and collectively towards their situation, especially their willingness to obey orders and to endure. Well, if morale is basically about not running away, combat motivation is a subset of more general morale, willingness to engage in offensive action, not just sitting there, but going out and doing something. And finally, it's a little known fact that every staff college lecturer, in my case, a former staff college lecturer, must mention Clausewitz at least once in every lecture. And my mention of him is that Clausewitz differentiated, when talking about morale, between spirit and mood. Mood is transient. It can be up or down depending on whether it's raining, whether the sun's shining, whether you've had a meal, whether you're hungry. But spirit is that essential willingness to endure and fight. And what I'm going to argue is, for the most part, the spirit of British soldiers at Helles was sound, although the mood certainly fluctuated from day to day, and particularly there's one crisis of morale in August 1915 I will be talking about. Well, there's all sorts of things we could mention about factors which influence morale at Gallipoli. I think they're broadly similar to the factors which affects morale of soldiers in modern warfare, wherever you're talking about. But what we're talking about at Gallipoli, of course, as anybody who's been there will know, particularly at this time of year. And something came up on my Facebook account yesterday reminding me that 6 years ago, I was actually on the ground at Gallipoli in July, which, if you've ever been there in July, it's really very hot. What we're talking about Gallipoli is extremes which can put morale under pressure. So when, for example, there was a soldier of the border regiment who's reminiscing about Gallipoli and says that he recalls those parched days when we willingly give a week's pay for a cooling draught of Bass, that hints at the particularly strenuous conditions endured by men out there. Also, and I think as a distinction from the Western Front, soldiers find it much harder to get any sort of decent sleep. And recent research on sleep suggests that this is really debilitating and particularly damaging to health if people are deprived of sleep and rest over a very long period. That's also true to some extent on the Western Front. On Gallipoli, on the whole, people had it worse. Well, for more than 50 years before the First World War, territorial volunteer force drill halls like this one in Manchester had taken its place alongside the pub, the chapel and the sports club as a mainstay of local loyalties. And I think the local loyalties of at least two of the divisions that served at Helles, the 42nd East Lancashires and the 52nd Lowland Division, I think are really quite significant. Now, this sort of local connection to these territorial battalions undoubtedly enhanced combat cohesion, but the downside of that was that when battalions took heavy casualties, as they did on Gallipoli, it could be a shattering experience if soldiers are seeing their friends, their relatives, people they've known for years, killed and wounded beside them. So Mike Horgan, for example, who arrived in Gallipoli in August 1915 as a reinforcement for the first 7th Manchesters, found that a lot of the pals I was looking for were already dead. And in Galashiels, the news of the appalling losses suffered by the 1st, 4th Kings of the Scottish Borders, the Cosbys, on the 12th of July 1915, still a day of mourning up in the Scottish borders, led to women openly weeping in the streets. It's just like Flodden again, one was reported as saying. Well, in more popular memory, it's the 1st of July 1916, in which is the first occasion on which British communities take a terrible hammering from losses of their men at the front. Absolutely not true, of course. In the case of Lancashire and of Lowland Scotland, it's July 1915. In fact, it's even earlier than that in some places. London, some London territorials took a terrible hammering in May 1915. So Gallipoli is the beginning of mass casualties for these two particular areas. And of course, casualties were extremely high. Losses in 86 Brigade during the landings famously led to the Dublin Fusiliers and the Munster Fusiliers being temporarily amalgamated as the Dubsters, and the costly offensives which followed piled up the casualties, but so did basic trench holding and also sickness rates. So to give an example, the 1st 5th Manchesters, again a 42nd Division, first went into the trenches on the 11th of May. In 3 months, of the 832 men who landed on Gallipoli, including 35 officers in May, about 70%, 582, have become battle casualties or were sick. That's basically, that's a battalion's worth, or pretty effectively, so we say 2/3 of the battalion's worth have gone. And as I've already mentioned, losses were exacerbated by the fact that drafts were slow to arrive in Gallipoli, and by the time the men pitched up, they'd already lost more men, so units are always under strength. Sometimes they're severely so. And this and the quality of drafts caused some concern. Major General Paris, GOC, of course, of the Royal Naval Division, complained of being sent war babies. And inevitably, heavy losses had an impact on combat effectiveness. Brigadier General William Marshall, temporarily commanding the 29th Division, after the fight of the 28th of April, so of course just 3 days after the landing, signalled that both the regiments and brigades are much mixed and thoroughly done. The combination of strong Ottoman resistance, the breakdown of the advance, and doubtless the cumulative effect of the heavy losses since 25th of April meant that 29th Division were within 3 days temporarily combat ineffective. And even in early June, the new GOC of 29th Divisions signalled that it was weak and in disarray. Similarly, the later offensives had the same effect. So that, for example, on the 26th of June, after the considerable success of the 42nd Division on the 4th of June, GOC 8th Corps, Aylmer Hunter Weston, reported that 42nd Division, with the exception of 127th Manchester Brigade, now very weak, are not at present of any great fighting value. Attrition at Gallipoli was absolutely brutal, and it wasn't just from the fighting. Well, there is some evidence from Helles which supports the idea that we do see the Marshall effect in action, in the sense of passivity of troops. In mid-May, a special order was issued by 29th Division, which read in part, "It must be a point of honour that for all that each day there is some advance to record, some Turks killed, or some important point in the line captured, or it is so dangerous that they will cease to make use of it." So clearly, High Command feared inaction, that left to their own devices, soldiers would simply sit there and not take aggressive action. And generals continued to be worried by this potential inactivity of their troops throughout the campaign. So, for example, Hunter Weston's successor, Lieutenant General Davis, Joey Davis, who had arrived on promotion from divisional command on the Western Front in September, wanted to reduce the numbers of men holding trenches in line with Western Front practice, which at one level was very sensible. However, the commanders of 42nd and 52nd Divisions opposed the plan, arguing that their ranks contained many young soldiers and the numbers were necessary to give them confidence. So clearly these generals understood the empty battle phenomenon, and really soldiers needed to see their men on their left and men on their right. Thinning things out made tactical sense. It did not make psychological sense in terms of enhancing soldiers' morale. Now, evidence of men failing to fire their weapons is pretty scarce, but one incident is I think, suggestive. Brigadier General Prendergast, commander of 126 Brigade in 42nd Division, told the Dardanelles Commission that he found 2 men in the trenches who did not know how to load their rifles. This is an extreme case, no doubt, but he found men and officers I considered mere recruits, unfit for the firing line. So lack of training, in other words, meant that soldiers didn't fire their weapons. But against this, we must set examples of so-called funk fire, when equally young and poorly trained soldiers would blaze away at anything, particularly at night, wasting ammunition. And of course, experienced soldiers learned neither to be passive nor to simply shoot off in the dark. Now, one aspect of the martial effect that certainly is true of VIII Corps at Gallipoli was the role of individual leaders in overcoming passivity of officers. And this, I think, is perhaps indicated by the high level of officers' casualties compared to those of other ranks. So Lieutenant Colonel H.C. Darlington, for example, of the 1st 6th Manchesters, wrote in early June that the authorities had forbidden the COs to lead their men into battle, that they should be in the rear of their commands to influence events and keep in touch with their brigade. Now, this essentially managerial approach clashed with the instincts of many officers, including Darlington, and particularly bearing in mind that many battalion commanders were soldiers of officers of a lower rank who were holding that command because everybody above them had been killed and wounded. They were holding the command at least temporarily. And so this is really against the stereotype of chateau generalship or chateau command. So Brigadier General William Scott Moncrief, GOC of 156 Brigade in 52nd Lowland Division, was killed on the 28th of June in the front line, where it was reported he had no business to be, while pushing forward a, quote, sticky battalion, the 1st 7th Cameronians. And during 1st Krithia on 28th of April, an eyewitness described the conduct of Brigadier General Marshall, who of course went on to finish the war with the triumphant campaign in Mesopotamia in 1918. His conduct at 1st Krithia was described as magnificent, walking about the whole day under a heavy fire, pushing men on. This is the opposite of chateau generalship. It also should be seen to be replicated at much lower levels, when junior officers are also displaying, literally leading from the front, displaying heroic tendencies in getting their men into action. One example of this is that of Sub-Lieutenant Frederick Septimus Kelly of the Hood Battalion, the Royal Naval Division. If anybody's not read this book, I thoroughly recommend it. It's basically, it's Kelly's letters and diaries, and it's an excellent read. It's a fantastic source. Well, during 3rd Krithia on 4th of June 1915, the Royal Naval Division, as you know, suffered appalling losses during the advance, with many officers being killed or wounded. Eventually, the whole line was forced back to its original position with very heavy loss. Now, Kelly was commanding a force in the British front line, and he was unaware of what was happening to the assault forces until, quote, there was a rather alarming rush back to our trench of panic-stricken Collingwood and Anson men. Well, he went out into no man's land to, attempt to arrest the rout. He said, I turned a few of them around, but there were too many of them for me to cope with. He then spent 45 minutes going up and down the trench, pushing them out again, ordering themselves to advance to the Turkish front line and report to any officer that they found. Well, about 30 men did indeed go over the parapet, but he soon discovered that most of them were simply lying down out in no man's land a few yards from the trenches. So he went out himself and personally led this group towards the front line. Once he'd got them going, Kelly returned to his own men, but he was wounded. Well, later he heard that casualties among the officers of the assaulting battalions had been very heavy, but so the men were leaderless and didn't know what to do. Now, I think this incident is really interesting in what it tells us about the Marshall effect. The initial attack broke down because of the intensity of the enemy fire, which resulted in loss of leaders. The brigade commander, Commodore Oliver Backhouse, suddenly reported that 4 key officers had been killed in the initial stages of the advance. And this seems to have had a disproportionate effect on the cohesion of the assaulting troops. Well, deprived of leaders, the troops who were poorly trained and lacked initiative, panic set in, but eventually the rout subsided once they have reached the R&D's trenches, and the calm, heroic leadership or charismatic leadership of Kelly steadied them, and he's able to lead them back to the front line. Well, at the heart of Tony King's work is the distinctive problem of combat performance and the citizen force. Someone I'm sure you're all very well aware of, at least aware of his book, is Joe Murray of the Hood Battalion of the R&D. This is what he, a citizen soldier, volunteered in the autumn of 1914. See what he said about the regular 2nd Hampshires. Their advance under such terrible fire was an object lesson to we civilian soldiers, and the value of training was brought home to us during those glorious moments. He's writing about this 2nd of May 1915. And in similar terms, a middle class territorial NCO, Cyril Barnes of the 1st 5th Manchesters, commented that the average soldier might be a rather coarse and vulgar chap, but when it comes to doing his duty, he's a perfect brick. But I should say that actually the discipline and training of even inexperienced citizen volunteer soldiers could also be effective. Coming under fire for the first time at Suvla in 6th of August 1915, a soldier noted in his diary that the discipline stood to us marvellously. We seemed to do the right thing at the right time mechanically, for you must remember that we were more or less stupefied. Think back to what I said about Hugh Strawn's argument earlier. This is actually a soldier who, once the firing begins, training kicks in, it takes over, and he goes through the motions and able to get through his first action in spite of the fact that he's almost behaving like a robot. Now, mass tactics in the form of bayonet charges were certainly used to overcome inertia. On the 28th of April, Captain Ellis of the 1st Boarders of 29th Division led his exhausted men in advance until they were held up by Ottoman fire. They were then faced with an open bit of ground of nearly 200 yards, literally swept by lead, and the only way I could devise of bringing the men up to scratch was to fix bayonets and to take them across at the charge. So for these bone-weary men, the crowd morale of a bayonet charge overcame their hesitation. Now, use of the bayonet charge was allied to the cultivation of extreme aggression in the men, and such bloodlust could lead to situations such as when the 1st 5th Manchesters avenged the ill treatment of our men by shooting and bounting everyone and only taking officers when only taking prisoners when the officer was there. Now, fascinatingly, this was a letter written by Corporal Barnes to his girlfriend at home in Manchester. basically telling her that he had been killing prisoners in cold blood. Well, Major General G.G. Egerton, the GOC of 52nd Lowland Division, said that short-lived panics among the troops in the front line are common in every way. And Hunter Weston concurred with this. Well, as far as the Gallipoli campaign is concerned, at least, Egerton was absolutely right about that. His comments were prompted by the events of the 13th of July, 1915. The 52nd Division had attacked on the previous day and taken Ottoman trenches, but had taken severe casualties in the process. The right flank of one of the battalions holding the newly captured trench, which was the 1st 7th Highland Light Infantry, the HLI, was enfiladed by sniping, bombing and machine gun fire, and the lack of men available and particularly ghastly conditions in the trench, especially the stench of unburied corpses, which caused men to vomit, that only a very primitive consolidation could be made during the night. In the early hours the following day, a small trickle of troops, which rapidly became a torrent, poured out from the trenches held by the right of the 157th Brigade and rushed back to the old British line. A handful of officers succeeded in rallying the men and stabilising the situation, leading them back to the captured Ottoman trenches. Well, obviously, the immediate cause of the rout was an order to withdraw in the exposed right flank, which people on the ground interpreted as an order to retire. But the official historian concisely summarised the underlying reasons for the rout of the 1st 7th HLI. Many of the men, parched with thirst and utterly fatigued by their first day of active operations, were nearing the end of their tether. So even before the panic set in, men had been finding excuses to go back, to escort wounded back, to find water, whatever it happened to be. But not everybody was caught up by this by any means. Some of 157 Brigade stood their ground and didn't join in with the rout. And on their own initiative, a machine gun team of 6 privates of the 1st 7th Royal Scots brought a weapon into the frontline trench to support the 1st 7th HLI. And also R&D officers intervened to rally men of the Lowland Division. Well, after the war, Egerton admitted that this incident was an undoubted panic, but it was sorted out within the hour. And this actually does seem to be the case. There's other sources which indicate the problem was of fairly short duration. Crisis probably being over in about 30 minutes. But the panic did have some significant repercussions. A garbled and exaggerated report reached Hunter Weston, leading him to order a fresh attack. He thought basically the entire line was collapsing. And also, undoubtedly also, reinforced doubt in the minds of higher command about the reliability of some territorial troops. Well, in terms of the Marshall effect, this incident, I think, demonstrates the problem of sending into the attack untried and poorly trained soldiers commanded by NCOs and officers themselves, many of whom were little better off in terms of experience and training. And again, the importance of individual leadership in rallying the men. I think it also suggests that the higher command's lack of trust of territorials, which was partly based on prejudice, actually was not entirely unreasonable. These terriers simply lacked the resilience of veterans. It also suggests, I think, however, that while the morale of these territorials might have been brittle, it was fundamentally sound. Once they were sorted out, once they were given leadership, once they were led back into action, they were fine. One eyewitness said he saw no sign of a retiral. The that officers and NCOs rallied the routing troops without difficulty the moment they were told to do so. The examples were the few nerve-shattered men who were stopped with difficulty. In other words, what we're seeing here is good old Clausewitz's idea of mood changing quite suddenly. For the most part, spirit was sound. Well, there are plenty of other examples of panics which I could give. I would just give one example of them. In the early hours of the 29th of May, the appearance of some Gurkhas in no man's land triggered panic among some men of the 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers of the 29th Division, who mistook the Gurkhas for enemy troops. And this meant that they rushed back from the front line. Well, 2nd Lieutenant Laidlaw, by his own account, himself briefly panicked, but then recovered his nerve, and in his own words, after pricking a few men with a bayonet, I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, he shouted for them to rally. And he said, as quickly as it had started, the panic died down and the men returned and jumped back into the trench. They were thoroughly ashamed of themselves and nothing would have moved them after that, although most of them had only gone a few yards. So this basic pattern is repeated time after time again. Soldiers' nerves broke briefly, they ran away, they were rallied by leaders, and they were brought back into the line. Sometimes, of course, officers and NCOs threatened to shoot men. And of course, famously on the 6th of June, 19-year-old Second Lieutenant GDR Moore of the 2nd Hampshires actually did shoot some British soldiers to stem a rout, and then led men in a counterattack, which retook a lost position. Famously, of course, Moore actually gets the Victoria Cross for this action, which include shooting his own men. I've never been able to find out whether these men were wounded or killed. I suspect they were just wounded, but if anybody knows, I'd be fascinated if you would tell us. Again, this points to the idea of the mood of the soldiers being volatile, their essential spirit being intact. Now, what I've spoken about so far is the first few months of the campaign, but I think there is a real change after the failure of the August offensive and the Suvla Bay landings. A sapper of 42nd Division argued that up to the failure of the August offensive, all believed that we were winning. It was just a matter of time until Aki Baba fell. And an officer of the 1st 7th Manchesters made pretty much the same point. He thought that the failure of the August offensive dashed hopes, and the whole aspect of the men changed. They were sick in mind and in body, and fatigue was incessant. In reality, sickness was endemic in 8th Corps long before then, as were other factors which were already mentioned as undermining morale, constant enemy fire, the heat, the flies, the appalling stench, and all the rest of it. But it strikes me it's the brutal ending of the hope that they were actually likely to win that undermined the morale of the men, their willingness to tolerate hardships because they knew they were going to win shortly. In other words, it's worth putting up with hardships in the short term to bring about military success in the longer term. Now, 42nd Division's heavy losses in diversionary actions in support of the August offensive, I think, are probably also relevant here. And you have much the same case being made by an officer of the Royal Naval Division, who argues in September and October, sickness rates, which are always a good indicator of the state of morale, were such that the, quote, war-weary divisions at Cape Helles melted like snow in the noonday sun. The figures for 52nd Division support this assertion and shows that the problem actually grew worse in November, peaking in mid-December. At the end of the year, the number of sick and wounded were more than twice as great as at the beginning of September. In mid-September, the 7th Corps DDMS stated that there is throughout the troops a general feeling of lassitude and depression, which lowers the powers of resistance to disease. However, he did go on to say, that's a hospital ship, by the way, he did go on to say he thought that the phenomenon had been worse previously, which suggests that the measures intended to boost morale that the new Corps commander, Joey Davis, were introducing, which I'll mention in a minute, were having a positive effect. Now, this shift in attitudes, I think, is well recognised by senior officers. Edgerton visits the trenches of 52nd Division in mid-September and said the men looked very haggard and worn and tired. I told them we're all pretty well fed up, but we've got to stick it. And you find similar examples from the Royal Naval Division, from the 29th Division, and indeed some troops who are more recently arrived on Helles. Well, discipline, sorry, I'm doing something wrong here, sorry. Discipline, I think, is another useful litmus test of morale. The Deputy Adjutant General in May noted that there had been relatively few crimes, military crimes, that is, considering all that was going on. And yet you find an increase in military crime in the second half of the campaign after the failure of the August offensive. And something fascinating, which I discovered in the course of my research, I didn't know this, that actually at the end of July 1915, brigadiers basically were empowered to remit suspended sentences, and they did away with field punishment number 1 at Gallipoli, basically because there was nowhere where men could be safely tied up for a period of time that was not within danger of them being hit by enemy fire, which for me says everything about the terrible conditions on Gallipoli. We also saw sick rates climbing after the August offensive, as people basically, I think, gave in to things like dysentery, which they forced themselves to stay into the front line when they thought they were winning. When it was clear that they were not winning, then they allowed themselves to give in to sickness, as it were. And of course, this had it created a vicious cycle. So, for example, the first 4th King's Own Scottish Borderers, nominally about 1,000 strong, on 13th of September, consisted of only 230 men, of which approximately 150 were holding the trenches, and many of these men were sick. So basically, fewer men had more work to do. Joey Davis's approach to morale was to have, if you like, a twin track approach, to tighten discipline in some ways, but also to introduce things like concerts, football matches, the Dardanelles Cup, and all the rest of it. So basically, tighten up discipline, but also give the men, as far as they possibly could, more of a break from the trenches. They saw the climbing of court martials in September, I think, was very largely down to increase in fatigue. And we also saw a rise in the numbers of self-inflicted wounds, to the extent that in November 1915, a GHQ memorandum was issued saying that anyone who was suspected or convicted of self-maiming, as it was described, would not be evacuated from Gallipoli. In other words, they would actually stay put on the peninsula. Shooting yourself does not mean you're going to get a ticket back to Blighty, or even back to Egypt or to Malta. Okay, one final case study is to say something about, in my view, the most striking occurrence of the Marshall effect at Cape Helles. That is the combat refusal, military strike is another way of putting it, of the 1st 6th Highland Light Infantry in their night attack in the Vineyard sector in the early hours of 16th of August 1915. Now, this was a strike. It's probably significant that these particular strikers were civilian soldiers, citizen soldiers who had been civilians only a few months before, and at least some of them would have been drawn from an industrial society in which trade unions would have played an important role. Well, basically, the Highland Light Infantry, the 1st 6th Highland Light Infantry, were ordered to capture some trenches at night in the Vineyard sector, which had been captured during very recent fighting. The plan was to use 3 waves of 30 men, each wave being about 25 yards apart. And at 02:30, Lieutenant Wiley climbed out of the front line trench and, as he said, walked in a crawling position for about 25 yards looking behind me. A voice close by him then said, "Mr. Wiley, the men are not following you." Wiley shouted, "Come on, 6th." But when reaching the Ottoman trench, he was as lone as far as I could see. And other officers had the same experience. Quite simply, a large majority of men had failed to leave the trenches and follow their officers. They'd either not left the trenches at all, or they only got a short distance once they'd gone over the top. Corporal Martin went about 10 or 12 yards forward of the front British trenches and saw men moving back on their hands and knees. And in effect, the assault was a complete failure. Now, some witnesses to the subsequent court of inquiry speculated that the rum ration may not have been diluted. The system in the battalion was for a mess tin of rum to be sent along the line, with men placed on their honour not to have more than a mouthful. It's possible that some men, lacking supervision in the dark, drank excessively and were emboldened by alcohol to defy orders. Or whatever the case, it is clear that men of the Highland Light Infantry used a number of strategies to avoid making the attack. Some pretended to have wounds or sickness, and in the dark it would have been difficult to tell who was genuine and who was feigning. Some people simply sneaked away in the darkness before the attack. One wave was reduced from 30 men to only 24 by various means. Several rankers claim to have heard an order to retire. It's unclear whether it's an outright lie or someone did actually pass along this unauthorized instruction. Outright defiance, in other words, was avoided in favor of evasion and malingering. And there seems to be some coordination in this. Some NCOs seem to have been in on the plot, as it were. Well, actually, this is not an example of lack of combat cohesion. It's an example of a great deal of cohesion. The problem is that cohesion was not directed towards the goals of the army. It was directed towards saving the primary group, or in other words, saving their own lives. One of the primary responsibilities of leaders is to ensure that the men do actually carry out the higher authorities' orders, and officers and NCOs either couldn't or wouldn't do this on this occasion. And it's interesting that the Court of Inquiry came out with all sorts of reasons why localised problems, but above all, I think the biggest one was these were men in mourning. They were poorly trained men who had been citizens just 18 months or so before, less than that even, and they had just seen many of their friends killed and wounded in a disastrous series of attacks, barely 3 weeks before. They were frightened, they were in mourning, and they carried out what amounted to, well, technically a mutiny, but in effect, a strike. Now, this was denounced as being unmanly, as letting down Scotland and the British Empire, but I suspect that the soldiers didn't bother overly much. Certainly 52nd Division was not entrusted with offensive operations for a bit. Later on in the campaign it was, but it did seem to buy them a bit of a respite. A few concluding thoughts. Sorry, that should have come up at some earlier point, but I got my slides out of sequence. Okay, let me finish by quoting Gerald Hurst, GB Hurst, who wrote one of my favourite books on Gallipoli, indeed one of my favourite books on the First World War, With the Manchesters in the East. He served with the 1st 7th Manchesters. So one of Bert Lee's officers, the guy whose letter I started off from. I'll come back to Hurst's comments in a minute, but what I've tried to do today is to demonstrate, I think, that Tony King's Marshall effect thesis actually, I think, does work quite well as applied to British troops at 8th Corps at Cape Helles. The men were spooked by the empty battlefield. They were poorly trained, and all too often they were indifferently led. And left to their own devices, they did display signs of inertia. So their officers used bayonet charges, extreme aggression, heroic leadership, and all the rest of it to get them into action. Now, having done quite a lot more research on this topic since I completed my work on this, I must say I am far from convinced that the Marshall effect applies to the British Army later in the First World War, even perhaps later in Gallipoli, or for that matter, later in the Second World War. Once troops become more experienced, once they become better trained, civilian soldiers like the Manchesters or the Highland Infantry or whoever can perform as well on the battlefield as anybody else. I think really it's a matter of experience, of training, of soldiers and leaders alike. To apologise for this this slide. Somehow my attempts to put a cross on Gerald Hurst has led to all this other stuff on it. Just shows I need to finish doing my PowerPoint course properly. But let me just finish with Hurst's comments. Again, refer this back to Bert Lee's comments at the very beginning of my talk about everyone being fed up and worn out. He said, Hurst, the average soldier on Gallipoli broke down after a month or two. Comparatively few endured more than 3 months. The memory that it dominates all recollections of Gallipoli is that of the grandeur of the British soldier of 42nd Division, their gallantry in the early assaults and their inflexible fortitude in the trenches, pestered by flies, enfeebled by dysentery, stinted with water and worn out by hardships, are a lasting title of honour. At Cape Helles, as on the Western Front, British military morale was generally characterised by stoicism and resilience in the face of adverse conditions. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. I'm not sure what's happened to Ian, but I'm sure he'll pop back on in a minute. So now we have time. Thank you very much for that, Gary. We've got some time for some questions. Let me see if I can get Ian back into the room. You may be on mute, Ian, if you're still there.
Yeah.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. That's no problem.
Yeah. I couldn't unmute it.
Put my mic on. I won't be a second.
No problem.
Right, off we go.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating talk and a really detailed analysis of morale and the connection between morale and training and leadership and so on. And as we are very used to your work interspersed with supporting personal testimonies from other ranks, from NCOs and officers. And of course, based on very clear historiography and the ideas of Marshall, I certainly found fascinating. So let's just have a look at any questions on the chat first of all. From Jonathan Davis, any thoughts on Ottoman morale, given the similar frontline experience? Any cultural differences?
Well, I haven't done any work on it, but I can make a few educated guesses. As you say, cultural differences are quite pronounced. As I understand it, many of the Ottoman troops are drawn from the peasantry of Anatolia and such like. You know, it's from very different conditions from the industrial cities of Britain. I mean, there would have been some from cities, but a lot of them were actually from the countrysides. And they were very tough. They were able to endure enormous hardships to a degree which I think British Empire troops would have found extremely difficult. They also had, I think, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on this, a very different relationship with their leaders. So if you remember the title of Ed Erickson's book, Ordered to Die, that gives a rather different impression from the leadership of British NAFMADA and ANZAC officers and NCOs. So I won't go any further than that because I really don't have any expertise in this, but I think what I would say is that you need to be very, very clear about the cultural context of morale. Even when we look at the Australians and New Zealanders, it's a bit different from the Brits. It's not wildly different, but there are some cultural differences. And I think these are important.
Okay, thank you. I can't see any other questions. There's comments on chat. A question from myself. There's one question come in which I'll refer to. Have you found any evidence that more VC actually did shoot British soldiers? Because I did a little bit of research on it, and it based on a comment by Bean, the Australian historian, who said that he'd heard that a British soldier British officer rather had shot his own soldiers. Is there any more evidence that actually happened?
Well, it's actually it's in his VC citation. That's where I first came across it, gosh, 20 plus years ago. Right. It's certainly mentioned in, I assume it's the 29th Divisional History. Steve might be able to help me on this. It's certainly mentioned in either a regimental or a divisional history. Right. And in Beaver de Lisle's unpublished account at the Little Hearts Centre in King's College London, he talks about Moore. I mean, he doesn't actually use the phrase, but basically it's a complete psycho. I mean, apparently Moore, when he was forced to go on leave, he would go and join, I think it's his brother, in a division in another sector, and he would go on raids and patrols for fun. I think it's indicative. I think I can't remember whether he survived, or I think if he didn't survive, or he died of sickness near the end. But anyway, in 1980, he was still a lieutenant. He hadn't got any further up. Yes. I think he might have been a brilliant, low-level commander, but not someone you would entrust with the lives of large numbers of men. No, he certainly did shoot people. I think there's no doubting that. I don't know whether he killed them or whether he wounded them. I've never found any evidence for that. If anybody's got it, I'd love to know.
Yeah, I haven't got anything more to add there. The Delilah account I've referenced before, and that's interesting because he does. I think that's quite clear that he does shoot, and he may mention 4 men.
That's right.
But as Professor Gary's saying, there is no evidence if he actually shot and killed anybody. But It's a very interesting, controversial story anyway, regardless.
Yes.
I can imagine someone like that being so cold-blooded to take out a revolver and shoot someone in a fleshy part of the leg or something like that, you know, or you know, to deliberately shoot to maim, rather than to kill. But you know, it's, if I say it unique, someone's really going to say no, it isn't. I struggle to think of another citation for a gallantry decoration which is on the back of shooting your own men.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I've actually had a question, Gary. I think you sort of answered it. I just wondered in your research how much you compared 8th Corps with the Anzac Corps there, but I think you sort of briefly touched on it, which is interesting. So,
well, I actually did a version of this talk in Canberra probably 2 years ago, and I sort of basically threw some Anzac stuff in, and chatting with people afterwards. This was at the Australian National University. They said basically what I said about 8th Corps was just as applicable to the Australians. I mean, possibly the Anzacs all around, which is really not very surprising, considering that they come from a very similar but not identical cultural background. And of course, many Anzacs were fairly recent British immigrants to Australia and New Zealand. The odd difference, I think, because I think relationships between leaders and led are rather more informal in Australian forces, and certainly the 29th Division. Although I do think they've got a lot more in common with the territorials of the 42nd and 52nd, indeed other units in both World Wars, than many people would have you believe. So I would say they're broadly similar, but there are a few local cultural differences. Interestingly, entirely independently of people writing about the 8th Division, Bean, I seem to remember, says something to the effect, the Australian official historian, about the slump in morale in August, after the August offensive. And actually, I think that the statistics back that up. So does Bill Gamage in his classic book, The Broken Years, and Chris Pugsley, I seem to remember, in his book on the New Zealanders at Gallipoli, makes the same point. So I came at this independently and then sort of thought, oh, I wonder what they've written about the Anzacs, and checked back and found, yes, other people have made these points. So broadly, well, in fact, they're very, very similar, but there are some local cultural differences, I think, in particular in terms of the relationship between the ranks.
Very interesting. If I may, Ian, just sort of one more question whilst they're coming in. Has your research sort of uncovered much in terms of post-August offensive, sort of namely the evacuation, where morale or fighting spirit and mood is going to probably be quite interesting in terms of those that knew they were going to get off of Gallipoli, almost having that feeling that they had failed there and leaving their mates behind on the battlefield. Anything significant there? You mentioned?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm struggling to remember it, but something I read quite recently is, I think it's a guy from the Australian Light Horse. There's some papers I got last time I was in Australia, who's clearly rationalising in his own mind. He's writing to his family and saying it's a terrible shame that we were off Gallipoli and we've left all our mates there. But on the other hand, you know, we tied down the Turks, we wore out, whatever, you know, just I mean, he's clearly rationalising it to himself. But what I think I would say is there's a definite upturn in morale in November and December 1915. And Peter Hart put it simply when I made that point in a talk I gave a couple of years ago now, is that because colder weather, fewer flies. And so that has a definite knock-on effect. And if you look at the morale boosting measures that Joey Davis takes, so anybody looking for a research project, Joey Davis as Corps Commander at Gallipoli, really interesting, and no one's done it to my knowledge. They do seem to have an effect. And similarly, you can see at both Anzac and at Hellis, and I think also at Suvla, that the Brits and the Anzacs are actually simply getting better at trench warfare by the evacuation, because they've learned how to do it. They've gained some experience, and so paradoxically, at the very point they're evacuated, they're better at trench warfare than they have been all the way through. I think that also builds morale, because they're giving it back to the Turk. They're not regarded as being passive, and I think there's a degree of professional pride in what they're doing. You know, they are soldiers. They are able to carry out trench raids. They're able to do this, that, and the other. So all of these factors help to rebuild morale after the trough, I think, of August, September 1915. And certainly once they get away from the Western Front to Egypt, and then at least in the case of the Anzacs and the 29th Division off to the Western Front, they take a pride in having been there. In other words, they reinvented in their own mind. So hence you have, I think, is it 1917, you have A for Anzac put on the sleeves of original Australian soldiers. 29th Division, of course, notoriously regard themselves as actually having, you know, seen some action at Gallipoli, and they get a horrible shock when they come across the Germans on the Western Front. Ditto the 1st Australian Division at Pozières. Haig, you know, rather tactlessly but truthfully says, you know, you're not fighting Bashi bazooks now, you're up against the toughest army in Europe, because it is a major step up fighting against the Germans on the Western Front, if no other reason because of the volume of artillery, which is far greater than at Gallipoli. But all of this is reinvented, and Gallipoli becomes a badge of pride. So Gallipoli sort of reinvents itself, or is reinvented, I should say, as what it is in Australia and New Zealand today, as, yeah, okay, we lost, but somehow we really won. We won a moral victory. A bit like England on Sunday night, but we won't go there.
Great, thank you, Gary.
Okay. Stephen, there's a question from, I should know his first name, but Mr. Yilmeza, if that's pronouncing it properly, from Istanbul. Very welcome any Turkish friends joining us. And he thanks Gary for his talk, as we all do. So French units were mainly formed by colonial soldiers. How was the view? What was the view of the MEF GHQ on French performance in Gallipoli? Any ideas?
It was generally quite positive, because there was an admiration for the French troops, as you largely say, they were Senegalese and Algerians and what have you, and Foreign Legion, because actually they did do well. I mean, in the fighting in July, for example, carrying out what was to be called on the Western Front bite and hold operations, the French did pretty well. I think they actually recognised them as being professional soldiers, which of course, on the whole, they were, at least officers and NCOs were. In the same way, there was admiration for Indian troops. Anybody who hasn't read Peter Stanley's excellent book on the Indians at Gallipoli, Missing a Treat, I'm not aware of a recent book on the French at Gallipoli. I'm aware of a couple of articles that have been written, but maybe I'm missing out there. But on the whole, they which one's that? Is that book on French?
Reluctant Partner.
Oh, I don't know that one. To my shame. Who's it by?
I think it's a basic rewrite of Cassar's original work.
Oh, well, I've read that. Okay, but yeah. And there's a decent chapter in Jenny MacLeod's book, edited book, Remembering Gallipoli, and didn't David Dutton do something as well? Anyway, but yeah. So I think the British are actually quite favourably impressed by the French. They're certainly sorry when the French are withdrawn towards the end. And the little I read about it, I think that British soldiers who actually physically come cheek by jowl with the French, again, are quite impressed by them, quite intimidated by some of them, by the Turcos and the Senegalese, I think.
And a question from Derek Robertson. Do you blame the 1st 6th Highland Light Infantry in August 1914 for refusing to attack given the futility of the attacks and horrendous casualties on earlier days?
At a personal level, actually, I do not. I would have been one of those ones sneaking away in the background, you know, having twisted my ankle accidentally on purpose. No, I don't at all. What I think is really interesting is how frequently this thing happened, or at least we don't know it happened very often, but I think that we would have got a few more rumours, and you don't often get this sort of thing coming through. I'm not really aware of anything on the Western Front like this, or really anything else at Gallipoli on this sort of scale. So what I think is fascinating is that there's a definite failure of leadership here. Not really, I think, at regimental level. I think Colonel Miller, the battalion commander, doesn't come out of it terribly well. I think he's sacked as a result of this. But I've no reason to believe that the platoon commanders or the company commanders were anything other than paternal and probably popular with their men. But the soldiers said, I'm just not going to do it. You know, no, thank you. Maybe if they'd been committed to an operation with an obvious chance of a success, or an operation which had an obvious importance, it would have been a different matter. But capturing a few trenches late at night, there's only, you know, about 100 men involved. Expletive deleted that for a game of soldiers, they appear to be saying, which is very much in the sort of mindset of the British working class of 1914, which is fascinating. You don't often see that coming out in that sort of blatant disregard of orders. So I think this is very much the exception which proves the rule, which makes it interesting.
Some interesting comments from Graham Walker about he's done some research on Billy Unsworth, and said that he wrote a letter. Billy Unsworth was a very young Lancashire Fusilier who was killed, saying the morale was low as they were stopped from having homely due to the amount of men going AWOL. Interesting point.
That's fascinating. I mean, if Graham would like to ping me an email, send me more detail, I'd love to have a look at that. That's because I've got really interested in the 42nd Division. Oh, by the way, I should have said at the beginning, if someone doesn't preempt me, and quite possibly there's someone on the screen who will, my next book, I hope, will be the British at Gallipoli. I mean, specifically the British at, you know, not the Anzacs, but the British Army, because a lot of interesting stuff's been written on it, but actually in bits and pieces. And I think there's still some stuff to be done, and there's certainly room to pull all of this stuff together. So this is one of my future projects, sooner rather than later, I hope, unless someone nips in first, which they may well do.
Looking forward to that. Paul Knight, who's been a speaker, one of our earliest speakers. So are there any parallels between the territorial and the new army divisions? Both had limited operational experience.
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, they're both, in effect, civilian soldiers. They're both citizen armies. And I sort of alluded to this at the beginning of my talk, that it's the territorials suffer from a bit of historical amnesia about them, and actually which reflects to some extent the amnesia about them at the time, because it was the new armies which had a sort of level of glamour which the territorials never quite had. Reason for this, I think, is down to the British have had a, how should we say, sort of odd relationship with part-time citizen soldiers, civilian soldiers, since the very beginning. If you think about, you know, sort of Rowlandson's caricatures of volunteers, Napoleonic Wars, jokes about, you know, who shot the dog when the volunteers on Wandsworth Common in 1859, and all the rest of it, right down and included. This is, I actually put in my chapter on civilian soldiers for my book, down to Dad's Army, which is, you know, the Home Guard, but it captures all the tropes, all the jokes about civilian soldiers, you know, old men, stupid boys playing at soldiers. It's all there. One of the things, the very interesting things I've done recently, is I've been appointed to the external scrutiny team, which is appointed as a parliamentarily mandated body, which looks at the current state of Britain's reserve forces, Army, Navy and Air Force. And basically, we've spent the last year going out to units, actually largely virtually for obvious reasons, and we've written a report on the state of play. And they asked me if I would write a historical appendix, and I've just drew all sorts of parallels between what was happening before 1914, First World War, Second World War, with what's happened today. And a lot of things have changed, but some things have not. It's always been a minority interest, and it's always, minority of the population that is, and it's always been open to a bit of ridicule down to this very day. Do you remember that series about 10, 15 years ago on the television, All Quiet on the Preston Front? You know, makes my point for me. So for all sorts of reasons, I think the territorials have not had the credit that they deserve. But of course, it is the territorials who go out on the Western Front, and they are the first reinforcements, along with the Indian Corps, to the BEF. It's the territorials who get sent in numbers to Gallipoli because they are available, along with the Royal Naval Division, which of course is in effect a new army division, and the Anzacs. The Anzacs, Australian and New Zealanders, their newly created formations largely built on the Australian and New Zealand equivalents of the territorial force. The militia, in the case of the Australians and the New Zealanders, even call it the territorial force. Very heavily based on that. So in many ways, Gallipoli is a citizen army campaign from the British Empire perspective, and the bulk of those citizen soldiers are actually territorials. And right. Whereas you do get people with some pre-war service arriving initially, large numbers of them actually join at the outbreak of war. Even those who do have pre-war service, probably only 3 or so years, no experience beyond maybe two or three summer camps and going out and playing soldiers on a Wednesday evening. So this really is amateur soldiers in the most literal sense. Darlington's letters, which I think were privately published. I read the version in the King's College, in a little heart centre at King's College, London. He has some very scathing comments about his divisional commander, whose name, William Douglas, Peevish Willie, as he's known, who basically would do almost anything to let what he calls an amateur soldier like Lieutenant Colonel Darlington actually command in the field. And someone who I didn't mention, but whose name completely escapes me, he's the brigade commander of the Manchester Brigade in 1915, died of wounds in Malta. Anyway, he's a pre-war territorial, rare territorial to get a brigade command, and Hunter Weston sends off Marshall, Brigadier General Marshall, basically to do his job, at least to oversee his job. And Marshall turns up at this game, Noel Lee, that's right, turns up at Noel Lee's headquarters to mutual embarrassment, particularly when Marshall realizes he's a really, really good commander, ought to be let to get on with it. But Hunter Weston insists on Marshall staying there for a week or whatever it is, and Marshall says, this is ridiculous. No, he's an excellent commander. Citizen soldiers at whatever level, from private to battalion commander to brigade commander, can learn, can gain experience, actually become excellent soldiers. The problem was at the beginning of Gallipoli, they lacked training and too few of them were given the time, as in they were killed or wounded or become sick, actually to build up that experience.
Okay, thank you. I'll just allow 2 more questions because we can't keep you talking all night, Gary. We'd love to. So there's, where have they gone? Yeah, from Sarah Snow, you talked about difference in morale in different cultures. How about ranks within British regiments? For example, officers versus soldiers, etc. Have you got any thoughts about any distinctions between the morale between the other ranks, the NCOs and officers?
Yes. In a sense, the lower your rank, the easier it is for you to maintain morale, because private soldier, statistically, certainly for the Western Front, I'll be surprised if it's not true for Gallipoli as well, is the safest rank to hold, as in you're less likely to be killed or wounded. Why? Because if you're an NCO, if you're an officer, you are often literally leading, exposing yourself and actually putting yourself in the way of harm. So I would say that all the things that apply to a private soldier also apply to officers and NCOs, with the added difficulty of the burden of responsibility. You have other men's lives are your responsibilities. So, you know, nobody in Gallipoli has an easy time, but once a private has finished his duty, he can get his head down. Company Sergeant Major is going to be filling out reports, he's going to be making returns. Officers are going to be summoned to O groups, to officers groups, to orders groups, and all the rest of it. So yeah, the demands on the morale of the NCO and the officer are different, are greater than that of the private. Otherwise, I think it's pretty similar in terms of, you know, is it hot, is it cold? Have you got mail from home? Are you eating liquid bully beef out of a can, or have you got something worth eating? They're broadly the same, but there are these additional pressures for leaders, for NCOs and officers.
Okay, thank you. And last of all, any thoughts? This is from Michael Llewellyn. Any thoughts about the role of fiction, e.g. A.P. Herbert, as a guide to morale?
Yes, well, thank you for that. Well, in fact, those who've read what's it called? The Last Battle, the Final Battle, the Something Battle by A.P. Herbert. Anyway, well, no, there's a chapter which has very little to do with the story about, you know, the Harry Penrose, the officer who's eventually shot. And if you read Herbert's memoirs, he says basically this is me putting into the book my experiences of Gallipoli. And I've written another article on Gallipoli, which is available free to download from the British Journal for Military History, in which I quote a chunk of it, in which he talks about just how unpleasant it is to be suffering from dysentery, and, you know, just the terrible things that the terrible experience that it was. So yeah, I've been a great fan of of the careful use of fiction as a source of evidence ever since I was a postgrad. My supervisor of my MA back at University of Leeds in the early 1980s, might as well be saying the early 1850s anyway, was Dr. Hugh Cecil, very sadly died last year. And he is the leading British authority on fiction of the First World War, particularly as a sort of middle-brow, low-brow fiction as a source for historical evidence. And he taught me that actually, if you apply the same sort of scholarly rigor you would to any other source, that fiction can be used. So in other words, you know, triangulate the evidence. If someone says something happens, does anybody else support it? Is it inherently implausible? And in fact, I've used fiction quite a lot over the years, because, you know, if you read a work of fiction, you're not going to rely on it for the exact tactical detail of conduct of a battle. I suppose you might, but you know, it's unlikely. You will, I think, be fair using it to assess the psychological reactions to battle, if it's a piece of autobiographical fiction. So, for example, oh gosh, my brain really is going. A chap who was in the 52nd Lowland Division, who was a journalist, and he then went on to write the 52nd Lowland Division's Second World War history as well. He wrote a book about Gallipoli, and it's basically his personal experiences in a fictionalized form. I think that's entirely valid as a form of evidence, providing you use basic scholarly methods of triangulating the evidence and all the rest of it. So yeah, I'm a big fan about using fiction. If anybody is going to use it, incidentally, you should always make it clear in the footnote or in the text that this is fiction, and a sentence somewhere, pointing out why you think fiction is a valid source is not a bad thing. I've just been marking master's dissertations, as you might have. Actually, you might have guessed from what I've just been saying.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I say a final thank you to Gary and ask you to show your appreciation, just a reminder, as I said at the beginning, if any GA members wish to book a place at the Cenotaph March past 14th of November, do so using the form attached to the recent newsletter. If you're not a GA member and you're here tonight, why aren't you a GA member? All the good things that are going on, all the things that we provide, and if you want to continue to support the organisation best at promoting Gallipoli, then have a look on our website at the bargain that is the membership fee. The next talk that we have, the last one before the summer recess, we don't have a talk in August, Tuesday the 27th of July at 7:30, and that's done by Anne Pedley, who's a retired lecturer, trustee of the Royal Welsh Fusilier Museum Trust, and an enthusiastic, very enthusiastic historian of the Great War. But that's about the Welsh soldier in Gallipoli, and I'm really looking forward to that. We've already got a lot of people signed up for that. If you want a link, just email me on the usual address. Steve, I bet I've forgotten something here, as I always do.
No, I think that's good. I think probably the only thing to add is maybe let people know we have hopefully a physical conference in October with 4 excellent speakers to be announced very shortly. So covering some very unusual aspects of Gallipoli, including the French contribution, which we often underdo. So I hope to rebalance it.
Saturday, October the 23rd, isn't it? Saturday, October the 23rd. Okay.
Can I just say something?
Yes, Gary, of course.
Just Googled it. It's George Blake, the author of that novel about Gallipoli, who went on to write the 52nd Lowland Division history in the Second World War, which I am writing about at the moment. It's fascinating. You've got a First World War veteran writing a Second World War divisional history.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, and it just remains for me to thank Gary once again for an absolutely fascinating talk with a great view of morale and an analysis of how it panned out in the Gallipoli campaign, and enjoyed it tremendously, as I'm sure you all did. So thank you very much, Gary, for your time. And I'm sure you did mention the Western Front Association. Many of us are members here. I certainly have been for donkey's years. But we really do appreciate the support that the Western Front Association gives this little sister organisation, the Gallipoli Association, only in terms of membership, of course, and in terms of membership.
Thank you, and I'm happy to come back and talk on another occasion, hopefully face to face.
Great, great. Thank you very much, Gary. Okay.